G'day, Tom. How are you, mate?
Good, Andrew. Good to be back.
Yeah. Conscripted in at the last minute.
Yeah,
We're all both going to be a bit lean on the facts, I think.
Let's not make a habit out of this.
We're going to talk about the Australian Government and Comcare identifying or accepting 3 of the union's new psychological hazards, bringing them up to a record 17. So we'll talk later about particularly fatigue, intrusive surveillance and job insecurity, but we'll come to that towards the end. What I've tried to do with the list today, Tom, is I've looked at where businesses have failed to apply their mind and reflect before they make decisions.
Yep.
So we see that in termination cases. We see it in flexible work requests. And the other thing on safety I've looked at is where individuals do the wrong thing and are now being prosecuted, which shows throughout the eastern seaboard, particularly of regulators, their willingness to prosecute employees doing wrong things in critical hazard areas. Okay, so we'll talk about that a bit more. But why don't we go to our first case, which is an interesting case of CBC lawyers.
Yep. I'll take it away.
You want to give a shot?
So in this case, an employee gave notice of her resignation.
Yeah, 4 weeks notice.
4 weeks notice, and also handed in a medical certificate certifying that she was unfit to work for the remainder of that notice, I believe.
That's right.
And this was due to the way she was being treated by the company, ultimately.
Ultimately, yeah.
And the company have sort of taken that and...
Well, don't forget, she did one more thing in returning her keys and things. She said some pretty...
She sort of unfortunately...
said some things which weren't very generous about the business as she'd left.
Yeah, on her way out. And the company have it seems like they've sort of tried to repackage that as a repudiation of the contract.
And they say they accept it. They say that her conduct demonstrate an intention to no longer be bound by the contract and therefore evinced an intention of repudiation. They accepted it. Therefore, it was a termination on behalf of the employee. So this is a jurisdictional argument, not the employer, and therefore there was no claim against them. And the Commission, after chortling a couple of times and chuckling into their beards, said, I'm not sure if it was a man or a woman, by the way, I shouldn't say that, said, look, it's a reasonable thing to do for a person to actually put in a sick certificate. That's never evincing an intention to repudiate. And although she may have said some rash things, that's not saying I'm not coming back to work, I want to stop now. It's a demonstration of frustration. So the jurisdictional argument won. She ended up getting some money out of it, which was bad luck for them, 2 weeks. But it was interesting because it showed once again that an employer with any sort of thoughtful process would have gone, she's just angry. But what this did is then exposed their own accounting flaws in their pay slips, and the Fair Work Commission has referred them off to the Fair Work Ombudsman. So it shows, first line, not a clever thing to do, bad result, damage the business brand, reputational risk. Secondly, exposes further and deeper and much more dangerous failings, which end up with the Fair Work Ombudsman. Not a really clever exercise.
That could have been avoided had they...
All they had to do was say, okay, see you later. That would have saved it all. Moving on to the next case. This is the Judas Growths and JB Investments case.
Yeah.
This is a woman who worked as a receptionist at a brothel and was sacked without any real explanation as to what it was, not by the owner, and there was all sorts of other behaviour, but Tom and I have agreed to avoid the salacious part of it.
Yeah.
We have, haven't we?
JFB Investments.
Yeah, we're avoiding the salacious part of it. And it's getting to the fact that she was not given a proper reason for being terminated and was terminated by a co-worker on the behest of the employer.
Yep.
So the question really here is very straightforward. Was there a valid reason? And the answer is no, there's no valid reason. Although this was a small business, okay? So jurisdictionally, a small business doesn't normally fall under the unfair dismissal regime. Here, the behaviour was so wanting in a reason of any sort that it brought in the jurisdiction, and she ended up with quite a significant payout. I think she ended up with about $8,000, didn't she, Tom?
Yeah, $8,500. Yeah.
$8,500. We might move on to the next one, Tom. You're in charge of that. So let's talk about flexible work. We've got a couple of flexible work cases coming up. This is an application by an employee, and the case doesn't mention the name of the employee in this case, but talk us through just a couple of the facts in this case.
Yeah, so in this case, the employer was a psychologist who was employed in Darwin to conduct face-to-face counselling. And sadly, she's fled to New South Wales to escape some domestic violence that was going on in her life. As a result of that, she's put in a request to her employer to work 22 and a half hours per week remotely.
So it's a Section 65A flexible work request. And what she did in that process was say, well, look, I'm ready, willing and able to work. I have no choice but to leave Darwin because of the circumstances, and you need to make adjustments. And what the employer said is, well, we don't do any telehealth. We do face-to-face. That's what you're doing. They did the process perfectly right. So they did the consultation part. They did then rejected it on the basis of business grounds. The business grounds were they don't have the clientele. The cost of actually establishing it would be significant without any guarantee of being able to deliver the services, and therefore it wasn't a suitable and reasonable request. What was lovely is, in this case, the Commissioner went to great length to actually analyse what the word reasonable means in it, and acknowledged that sometimes flexible work will cost a business a little bit of extra money. But in this case, it was unjustifiably high without any proper outcome that could be determined, and it was unreasonable. So in this case, I think it was Commissioner Sloan said, no, reasonable rejection, upholding it.
Well, you said it's always somewhat of a balancing act between the reason for the request and the business needs, but in this case, it was so obviously in favour of...
And we don't often see a case which is so articulate in showing where that difference sits. But if we go on to look at the next one...
By contrast.
Yeah, by contrast. And this is the Catholic schools case. This is a really interesting case, Tom, because the Catholic schools have a policy that says, if when you're coming back from parental leave, if you want to work part-time and you're in the executive lead or executive part, you've got to go back in the classroom. Otherwise, it's full-time. So it's set. That's what happens. So in this case, an employee says, look, I want to come back. And they say, look, policy says no, bad luck. Can you just see that fails all
Set it too late as well.
Yeah, so there's no consultation. There's no evaluation of business needs and individual balancing. And it's completely unreasonable. And so they lost. And so they had to provide her, this is the risk of a flexible case, they had to provide her. They lost all the options. There was no negotiation at the end. Her flexible right was enforced. So a powerful case that shows you, if you don't think this through, you might get exactly what you don't want. Imagine if they had have thought, well, we can't do 22, but we could do 30. They had all these options that were open up until the time they irrationally went ahead without reflecting. Remember, every case we've talked about today was a muscular reaction except for one,
which
is the Darwin case.
In this case.
Yeah, and here's one of just muscularly saying, no, we've got a policy, we're not going to adjust around you. And that's not what the law says. Now, Tom, I thought we might talk about, this is a fascinating case, and given some of the history you and I have talked about in the background around enterprise agreements and voting up, and whether it is, whether the vote is genuine for voting up an enterprise agreement. Now, I'm not going to identify anyone here, but
I know who they are.
Certainly in my past, when we were doing greenfields and we were doing complex enterprise agreements, it wasn't beyond my remit to find consultants who would cultivate a group of people who would be the voters. They weren't terribly representative. We would make sure they won in each classification sort of thing. And they'd vote up this nascent agreement and it would be allowed through, and then we'd fill the place with employees on the terms that we wanted, okay? Not now, the Fair Work Commission would not like that process, but this is a case where what was done is the only people who voted in this were casuals, and yet many of the roles were permanent roles, and they didn't properly reflect the structure of the employment that was going to be there. And not surprisingly, the Fair Work Commission said, look, it's not a proper representation. This is not a genuine vote, and rejected it. So I put this on there because there are still consultants out there who are seeking to manipulate and telling employers what a clever trick it is to manipulate who votes up. What happens now if the union does get involved, as occurred here, is you will be caught out. Now, when you're caught out, I want you to understand that everything that happens with that enterprise agreement going forward is a poison chalice, and the nature of your relationships with your employers afterwards is poison. So it's clever in a funny sort of way if you get away with it, but once you unionise a site because of that, you will never lose the union because of your disingenuous behaviour that you've done with it. All right, we're on to some safe stuff, and a termination case, which is more an MLR Australia. Now, this was a pregnant woman, Tom, who was carrying milk, large containers of milk, and she was carrying them in an unsafe way. The owner, I think, was a fairly straight shooting sort of person,
Hard-nosed.
a bit hard-nosed, and the discussion that the owner had was deliberate and direct, but probably not helpful. But the owner's concern was safety. It wasn't the fact that she was pregnant. Now, she had a very difficult argument with him. She became angry. She left. He didn't terminate her. She alleges that he did terminate her because of her pregnancy. So there's a general protections claim and a jurisdictional argument. At the beginning of it, was it a termination at the behest of the employer? And what happened in this case is the court listened to the owner and said, gee, you could have done a lot better job, but you never terminated her. And it wasn't the pregnancy that you were concerned about. You weren't terminating for that reason. You were terminating you weren't terminating. You were telling her off about doing something unsafe, and she continued to do the same unsafe thing. Now, why is this a good story? Well, it's not as with all terminations, it's got a dark side, isn't it? Because people lose their jobs, they get upset and hurt. But can you see how safety continues to weave its way into employment law? And if you have a good safety basis for doing things, you win every time. And this is a case where it would have been better if it had been more articulate. It would have been better if you gave her a letter saying, you're doing things unsafe and why, and what is the control that's in place. They would have all been better things. Yeah, they were paramount. But the Fair Work Commission is a very hands-on tribunal. It's not like a superior court. They take people for their bumps and roughness. They take them for the genuineness of what's occurring. And in this case, the owner's genuineness came through and this person lost their jurisdictional argument and therefore has no claim. Now, what I do want to do is drop off to a couple of safety cases, which are more me than you, to be honest, Tom. They're more my game.
Yep.
The first one is an interesting case, and it's a really simple case, but an important one. Throughout safety law and the regulations that sit around safety, and through the electrical safety legislation and through a number of different pieces of legislation that touch upon safety, there are requirements for certification, licenses and the like. And they're there for a reason. They're there because they say in respect of that thing that that person or that structure is safe to use. In this case, a worker certified that a scaffold was safe to use, and it wasn't. Nobody was hurt, but he was charged. Now, why is he charged? I'll tell you why, and that is outside psychological hazards, the two biggest issues that the regulators focus on are working from heights and motorised plants. So today I'm bringing you one of each.
Yep.
But the point is here, the certification was not a real certification. It was a tick and flick. And it wasn't safe, and it placed people at significant risk. So this employee was not only charged with must exercise reasonable care to prevent risk of injury to others, they were charged with a much more serious charge of placing someone at risk of serious harm and being reckless in respect of it. Now, the fine doesn't represent the seriousness. But as I've said about sentencing before, we always start at a low level. We put our finger in the water as a regulator and a court, and then we gradually build. In 5 or 6 years' time, this person will be looking at a very significant fine, one which is debilitating for their future, one which will damage their capacity to pay their mortgage. It's serious stuff. So,
what was the fine, do you know?
Yeah, 15 grand, Ross, yeah.
And that's low.
That's low, yeah,
Wow.
Very low, given the risk that sits there. And if you look at you look at the recent Victorian Court of Appeal case, which deals with lower level corporate wrongs, they have doubled the tariff in the last 12 months. So they have lifted the tariff to reflect what is the scope of punishment you can receive. Now, where a fine could be $300,000 for an individual breach, $15,000 is pretty low, okay? This is a really serious breach. No one got hurt, but a person could have been killed. And remember, when we're dealing with primary duty breaches, there is a disconnect between the damage that is done and the wrong that is created. When you get to recklessness, and obviously workplace or industrial manslaughter, part of the sentencing process is the harm that has been done. But a primary duty, it is the risk that you're being prosecuted on. So, interesting case and a flag for the future. The next one is Gallichan and WorkSafe, a Victorian case. Again, this is a health and safety representative who was driving a forklift. Now, I've put this on for two reasons. One, again, this is a punishment of individualised around motorised plant. Why is it happening? Well, because the regulators are focusing on working from heights and motorised plant. And here is an HSR who most people would think are untouchable, okay? Because they do have an indemnity in respect of their acts as an HSR. They're usually industrialised, so to touch them all, to quote CFMEU, you take on an HSR, you're taking on a union normally. But here, WorkSafe say, but this isn't about his HSR duties. This is about his role driving a forklift, where he elevated lumps of steel and placed employees at risk. No one was hurt. Again, in this case, the fine was $2,500 to a notified charity and $5,000 costs. This is way too low, way too low, and misses all 3 Court of Appeals in Victoria's reviews of sentencing. This is not an acceptable punishment, okay? I'm not sure the DPP will challenge it. They ought to, based on the most recent Court of Appeal case. But what I'm saying to you is we've given you 2 examples in the last few weeks that have come through where sentences have been handed down to individuals who breach rules which WorkSafe are focused on prosecuting. So it's no longer the organisations alone, it is the individuals themselves, okay? Why don't we kick on to the major topic?
So then the main topic, we're going to talk a little bit more about these 3 psychological hazards that have been added to the government's code of
conduct, and also to the general discussion around what are and what are not psychological hazards. At the moment, there's 14 psychological hazards. 4 of them are egregious. They're trauma, exposure to violence, aggression, sexual harassment and bullying, okay? There's significant wrongs. And the other 10 are design and leadership-based issues. But the new 3 of fatigue, intrusive surveillance and job insecurity are ones which have been agitated by the unions for a long time, and quite properly so. When we look at fatigue is not just, I'm tired because I've been working really hard on a spade for the last 10 hours, but it's important. It's not just I'm driving a truck for 10 hours, which there's a whole lot of legislation around. It can be emotional, it can be psychological, it can be a combination of any one of those 3. But the issue is the need to assess the level of risk that sits around a known hazard and to develop a plan which prevents that from actually impacting the person and making them unsafe. Now, in Victoria, when we look at the new code and regulations, which will come out in December, this is not one of the recognised hazards at the moment, but I'm sure by the time it does come out, it will be. It certainly won't be one of the hazards that requires a prevention plan, of which there are 6. But what we've been saying to everyone, which you and I and all of our team have been saying, is prevention plans are a great idea. If you're going to do it for one group, such as sexual harassment, why not do it across the whole lot? Because it assesses what is the nature of the hazard, what is the risk, what are the proper controls, and has a process going forward. I'm just adding that bit in there. But for fatigue, it is a huge issue in every industry. In ours, when we have sort of really big fights on, we can be working all hours of the day and night. Trucking industry, construction industry, all types of professional service industry, retail, hospitality, nursing. It's a big issue, isn't it? Particularly where you have rotating shifts. So there needs to be planning, awareness and understanding. Intrusive surveillance has really popped up over the last...
So sorry, just to get back on the fatigue, for something like a night shift construction worker, would his or her employer have to pay particular attention to that, knowing that maybe the hours of work are...
Yeah, look, I think where there is a higher risk of exposure, you should be saying hello to your workers when you come on seeing them. You should certainly be looking for signs of fatigue. So if you're seeing someone yawning, they're a bit disorientated, they look tired. It's common for me when I'm dealing with parents in our own business of young children that I'll check in on them from time to time, because you do get fatigue with young kids. You're up all night with them. So I'll say to those people, give us a heads up if you're struggling. Do you want to work from home when that occurs? Do you need a bit of a sleep? So there are things that tell you that fatigue is more likely to be real, but you need to keep looking for the symptoms of it.
Yeah, cool.
If we can talk about surveillance really became a big issue around the time you get a GPS work around about 10 to 15 years ago. The unions have been really strong about the misuse of GPS around misconduct. And the Fair Work Commission has said, look, GPS is mainly meant for safety-related issues. So you see it in the truck industry a lot.
Yep.
But it can be used when you're concerned about behaviour and conduct as well. But where it becomes intrusive, where it starts to affect the way you live, where the GPS is, when you're at home, it's tracing everything you do, it becomes a form of micromanagement, then it becomes a real hazard, okay? When you're constantly thinking about being surveilled. Since COVID, we've seen it in a whole lot of methods of surveilling people working from home, whether it's a camera on them all the time that's always live, whether it's keyboards. I think this is a really good thing.
Horrible.
I think it's horrible. And I think that often the measures that are used to do it don't seem to represent what working from home is designed to do, which is to give people outcome expectations rather than presence expectations.
Yeah.
In other words, when people work from home, you have an expectation of output. You do realise that from time to time the person will go out and sit in the kitchen, read a bit of a newspaper for 10 minutes and come back. But you're paying people for output. It's a different way of thinking. And I guess the last part, which is a burgeoning part of our whole economy, which is insecure work, which is contracting work, casual work, gig work. We've seen, so for instance, when I started work a long time ago, Tom, casualisation of labour was under 10% and independent contractors was 6% of total labour force. We're now seeing independent contractor work up to around about 30% casualisation. I don't know what the figure is now, but it's extraordinarily high. And we've seen the emergence of gig work, which is dramatically changing the nature of work. So what this hazard is saying is when someone does have insecure work, what are the protective factors you as leaders will introduce to mitigate the impact of that hazard?
We were talking about the example of, I asked what would a company like Uber or DoorDash or someone like that whose workers are, they're inherently insecure jobs.
Yeah, so the answer so one of the things is to ensure that they don't appoint too many people so the work becomes insecure and thin and irregular.
Yeah.
Which is one of the risks that Uber did early on in Australia, where they overwhelmed the amount of Uber people and people weren't able to maintain the capital value of their vehicle on the monies that were being earned. That changed and they've shown. The other part is to ensure that people do feel safe, they do feel connected. There are measurements that they can see around their success, that there is a regularity of shifts and things provided which allows people to have secure money to know that they are going to make it through. So they're the protective processes that sit around good leadership, knowledge and clarity, and they take away that hazard. But look, I think it's a fascinating area and we are going to see this attack on the gig economy because it's designed by the unions to deal with the gig economy. Tom, can I take you over to the case study and I'll let you read it, mate?
Of course.
It should be quite new to you.
Yeah. So Gaynor works from home as a sales lead for a major insurance and investment fund business. Although she is employed under an award, she has signed an individual flexibility agreement, which assumes 45 hours of work per week. She is paid well above the award rate and the agreement compensates her regardless of the time of day or night she works. In reality, her average working hours are around 52 hours per week. Gaynor has 3 children, aged 6, 9 and 12, one of whom has a significant learning disability. She recently separated from her husband, who has been acting in an aggressive and destructive manner. This behaviour has included sending aggressive texts to both her work and personal phones from various numbers, sending explicit emails accusing her of infidelity and calling her abusive names, as well as visiting her home to scream abuse through her windows and issue threats. Despite a restraining order being in place, he has continued this behaviour. Her employment is classified as casual and her attempts to convert to a permanent role have resulted in diminished and irregular work, highlighting the precarious nature of her employment. Although her workload eventually resumed, it remained erratic, urgent and complex. Her manager, Ben, has frequently reminded her how easily her role could be made redundant and that she must work hard to retain it. Since the onset of COVID-19, the business implemented keystroke monitoring, even though much of Gaynor's work involves designing client solutions rather than constant typing. This surveillance has resulted in her receiving 2 formal warnings over the past 2 months, along with being placed on a performance improvement plan. As a result of her chaotic workload and ongoing personal difficulties, Gaynor has developed anxiety, insomnia, and skin rashes. She has informed her employer of these issues, requested a referral to the Employee Assistance Program for stress, and disclosed to Ben the significant impact of both personal and work-related stresses on her mental health. Ben advised her to enforce the restraining order. I assume that's against her partner?
Yeah.
Yeah. In the past two...
You're not against Ben. No.
In the past 2 weeks, Gaynor has made 3 errors. First, she fell asleep and missed an important Teams meeting with a client. Second, she made a calculation error regarding a client's premium. Third, she failed to meet the keystroke threshold, which implicitly suggested and was explicitly stated by Ben that she had incorrectly claimed work hours. As a result, the business has issued her a show cause notice and scheduled a disciplinary meeting.
All right, an unsavoury story really, but the first question is, does she have a good workers' compensation claim? And the answer is for so many reasons. If we take away the performance management process, which is flawed, so in workers' compensation land, which doesn't have a legal basis for a lot of what it does, it would say if you're going to tell somebody you want to have a meeting with them about show cause, you would go to them, ensure they had a support person present and that they had adequate support. Didn't happen. So it's not reasonable management action under any basis. Therefore, the objective test, was it fair to do it and was it done in a fair way, fails on the second basis, not done in a fair way. And for other reasons we'll talk about, it fails the first basis, it wasn't fair in the circumstances.
Yep.
Secondly, most of the behaviour is not related to performance and it is a hazardous environment which she subjectively experiences pain and harm. That experience is subjective test, so she definitely has a workers' compensation claim.
Right. Would a termination result in an unfair dismissal and or general protections claim?
Interesting here because we've got both, and the answer for both is yes. So let's just start with the unfair dismissal. Was there a valid reason for termination? Well, there's actually no evidence there was. The missing an appointment and sleeping, given the causative features of it, lay with the business and not a valid reason. And the keystrokes thing is an undemonstrated test of work, which doesn't work well with the nature of the work she did. So it's not a measure. So the answer is it would fails unfair dismissal just on the threshold of valid and fails every other of the other 4 tests. Was it done fairly under the Fair Work Act? Was it harsh? Yes, it was. Was it unjust? There was no legal basis for doing it. Yes, it was unjust. Was it unreasonable? Yes, when you look at what she was doing in the circumstance, it was unreasonable.
All of this because they've fired her for something like underperforming in a way that is not relevant to her.
That's right. Not only that, they're causative for the problems that led to it.
Yeah,
so the second part is general protections, and that has a dirty smell about it very, very early on when it comes to the precarious nature of her employment. Because when she raises a complaint, when she raises, I want to be permanently employed, they deliberately alter the manner in which she works. And Ben keeps telling her, you could lose your job any day. Yeah. That's pure general protections. Yeah. And the termination based on her complaint and advising them she is failing and then relying on spurious grounds would get up any day and reverse onus general protections. So she's going to win. Tom, how many psychological hazards can you count? I count 17. How many do you count?
The ones that jump off the page. We've been talking about job insecurity being a psychological hazard. It's mentioned that Ben frequently reminds her of how easily her role can be made redundant.
Yep.
Not only that, you just said before, when she attempts to convert to a permanent role, he deliberately makes it so that she finds it hard to sustain and perform in that role, like making her work erratic and complex.
So fatigue's also there, isn't it?
Fatigue, there's anxiety.
There's surveillance as well, intrusive and unreasonable surveillance. Can I just say to you, there are 17 hazards in this problem because if we go to the egregious ones, there's threats of violence and aggression and the experience of those.
Where's that again, sorry?
That's at the very beginning of the story. That's by a husband, but when she is working. Yep. Remember, those threats don't have to come from co-workers. And this is one of the
phone calls coming through to her.
Phone calls, standing at a window, screaming abuse, threatening her, emails to a work email, phone to work phone. All those things are the responsibility of the employer to help prevent. Now, that might mean that she can't work from home, okay? That's one of the conversations should have happened a long time ago. Some of it is a sexual nature, so it doesn't matter that it's an ex-husband. They're explicit, they relate to infidelity, they're definitely sexual of nature, they're definitely bullying, they're repeated. So all 4 sit there. Ben's behaviour is also repeated behaviour, which is unreasonable, which hurts, humiliates, and affects her safety at work. So it's bullying by him as well. So we're not going too well for this business, and then we've got every type of poor leadership and design.
I was just thinking it would be difficult, I think, for an employer to recognise that it's unsafe for them to stay at home and then to have like the courage to say, you need to come in for that reason?
Well, no, we've done it in our business.
Oh, really?
So, we early on in the business, we had an employee who experienced difficulties at home.
But to order that?
Yeah, no, where I'd spoken, we went and got some external help where we sat and we mediated the process out of it with the employee that said they are not to work at home. They are to work away from home. So I think flexible work and work from home creates certain risks which you can't run away from, and this case highlights it. But for Tom and I, it's every single hazard is there, including the new ones, and that was the purpose of the problem. So the next question, Tom, is who would be prosecuted?
Well, clearly Ben, I think.
Ben in the business. And remember, prosecution in safety law is attributional. That means whatever Ben does, the business is liable for unless he's on a frolic of his own. He's not on a frolic of his own. He's doing actually what the business requires him to do. Therefore, primary breach company, primary breach for Ben, failing to exercise reasonable care to prevent injury to another person. But he is aware, and therefore the business is aware, of her precarious state of health, the damage that is being done to her as a result of all the things we've talked about in those hazards. So this is off to reckless endangerment territory. Do I think Ben would go to jail? No, I don't. Do I think the business would be fined based on the most recent Court of Appeal over $2 million? I think that's a high chance it may be. And I think Ben may find himself with a pretty serious order against him as well. So there you go, guys. That's it for this week. Tom, well done. I'm sorry I talked too much, but I thought I'd better get you out of jail. I realised I'd ask you at the very last minute. Thanks to Toy and the team behind the scenes for all the hard work, Nikki and the crew. See you next week.